This morning, we're in John chapter 19, continuing on our study of the book of John. And you remember last week, the soldiers came into the garden and arrested Jesus, and Peter had his sword in his hand, cut off the high priest's servant's ear, and Jesus healed that ear. We don't find that in John. We find the healing in one of the other books. But that was the last healing that Jesus did in his ministry, was healing the high priest's ear. And then they had that sham of a trial. There was no decorum in that trial. There was no humility. They went so far as to slap Jesus when he didn't give the answer that they wanted. And then they brought Jesus before Pilate. And Pilate says that I find no fault in him at all. There in chapter 18, verse 39. And then, as a boon to the people, Pilate offered to release Jesus, but they rejected Jesus and chose Barabbas. So Jesus remains in custody, and Barabbas, a robber, I think a murderer, a malcontent, was set free. In chapter 19, starts with these words. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe and said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they smote him with their hands. Now this is a very dark development, that Pilate decides to scourge Jesus. Normally, the prisoners were scourged trying to extract a confession. This is something that was done in those days, a very brutal way of getting a confession. And so they had Jesus scourged, and the soldiers mocked him. And this is part of the process of breaking down a person's will. To break down a person's will and make them confess their crime. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus submitted to their humiliations and remained silent. As the prophecy says, like a sheep before his shearers. He didn't cry out. And so Pilate therefore went forth again and said unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. So a second time, Pilate says that he finds no fault in Jesus. And Jesus came forth wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said unto them, Behold the man. So this crown of thorns, you'll remember, will take you back to the garden after Adam and Eve sinned. There was a curse upon the ground. And God said that the ground will yield thistles and thorns. And so these thorns are a symbol of the curse. That Christ had the curse upon him. He was taking the curse. Now the chief priests were not at all satisfied with this. Even though Christ was beaten to within an inch of his life, and people often died under these scourgings, the chief priests were not satisfied. They cried out, crucify him, crucify him. And this was an intense, visceral cry to crucify Christ. They were eager to have the wicked deed done. When we were growing up, we lived in a little house. It wasn't that old, about 50 years old or so. And we would see these termites in front of the door occasionally. Once in a while, we'd see one crawling around. And one spring, my dad got ambitious and decided to open up that door frame and see what was in there. And so he got the pry bar out and pried around and opened up that lintel there. And all these termites came scurrying out all over the place, crawling on his legs, crawling on his hands, jumping around. He was stomping around trying to get those termites. And he saw the queen making her way into the flower garden. And he said, I want to get that. And he jumped over there and he's stomping around. And he was intent on making sure he killed that queen termite. He didn't want her to get away. And that's the way these chief priests are with Jesus. Nothing else will do except that they put him to death. And so they cried violently, crucify him. And Pilate answers, take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. And the Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. So this law that they're referring to is found in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18. Let's just read a little bit about what this says. Deuteronomy 18:18. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee. It's talking about Moses. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Doesn't that remind you of Jesus? That he's here about his Father's business, and he only speaks what the Father tells him to speak. How many times did we hear that going through the Gospel of John? Verse 19, and it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. In other words, the people will be held accountable if they do not hearken unto the words of the prophet who's like Moses, who speaks face to face with God. Verse 20, but the prophet which shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, even that prophet shall die. Anybody who takes the name of the Lord in vain, or speaks in the word of a different God, that prophet shall die. And then you hear this in verse 21. And if thou say in thine heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord hath spoken? It's a fair question. Is this person really from God? This is how you'll know, verse 22. When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. But the prophet has spoken it in presumptuously. Thou shalt not be afraid of him. So in other words, if the words the prophet speak come to pass, and that's a true prophet. That's a true prophet, and that is the Son of God. And the Pharisees and leaders knew this. And how many times did you see Jesus speak and heal somebody? Even in the garden, he healed the high priest's servant's ear. In spite of that, they were claiming the law. They were claiming the law as they broke the law. They were turning away from God the way their ancestors had turned away from God. They were turning away from him here. So when Pilate heard, we're back in John chapter 19 now, verse 8. When Pilate heard that saying, that he made himself a son of God, he was more afraid. So Pilate was already feeling a bit edgy. He had interviewed Jesus, and the charges that they brought against him was he said he's the king of the Jews. Remember in his earlier interview, Pilate asked him, "Are you a king?" And Jesus gave him that answer, that his kingdom is not of this world. And now, they're bringing a new charge. Jesus is the Son of God. And now Pilate is more afraid. So after Pilate heard that, Pilate went into the judgment hall, and he asked Jesus, "Whence art thou?" But Jesus gave no answer. So again, Pilate was trying to extract a confession from Jesus, trying to get at the reason that the Jews had brought charges against him. So they had brought charges saying he was a king, he was the Son of God. Now Pilate perhaps expects Jesus to sue for an acquittal. But Jesus doesn't do that. He is silent in the face of Pilate's questions. So Pilate, feeling a bit of chutzpah possibly, said unto him, "Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and power to release thee?" Pilate had the power to release Jesus. Pilate wanted to release Jesus. His cowardice and fear kept him back from releasing Jesus. So Jesus deigns to answer him. "Thou couldst have no power," again these words, "at all against me, except it were given thee from above." Then Jesus goes on with the part 2. "Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." So Jesus gives Pilate a civics lesson. And the lesson is that the installed, vested authority is established by none other than God himself. And that we as citizens should respect vested authority. And that those in authority have a responsibility to God to act righteously. Now Jesus implies here as he's talking to Pilate, he implies that Pilate has sinned. He has sinned already. And at the end of that verse he says, "He that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." So Pilate sinned, and that he had an innocent man scourged. Instead of releasing him, which he had the power to do by his own words, he had the power to release him. Instead of releasing him, he had him scourged. He'll be held to account for that. But the ones who delivered him over have a greater sin. He's talking about the Jewish authorities. They have a greater sin. They should have known and recognized Jesus. He's talking about Judas, who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And after Judas betrayed Jesus, what did he do? Judas says these words. He says, I have betrayed innocent blood. So at every turn, you see Jesus is innocent. Everybody recognizes that except the Jewish leaders, who should recognize that. And because they didn't act on what they knew, they will be held responsible for that, and that's counted against them as sin. From thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever makes himself a king against Caesar. So the Jews see that Pilate is waffling. Pilate is inclined to let him go. So they think up the most outrageous charge that they say that if you let this man go, you're not a friend of Caesar's. Because Jesus called himself a king. Because that was the charges brought against him, that he is a king. This was a very turbulent time, and any charges of sedition were dealt with great alacrity by the authorities, great enthusiasm, and Pilate didn't want to get swept up in anything like that. Pilate didn't want to be against the king or appear to go against Caesar. In today's world, we would say it's bad optics. So this, when they threatened this, it pushed Pilate. Verse 13, when Pilate heard that, saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. This is a elevated dais. The Bible dictionary says it was a tessellated marble floor. And this is the seat that Pilate sat to pronounce judgment. And he condemned Christ to be crucified. We continue on. It was the preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour. And Pilate said unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said, Shall I crucify your king? And here the chief priests give this astonishing answer. We have no king but Caesar. And they rejected Christ. About 40 years later, the Romans would come and overrun Jerusalem, tear it to the ground. They burned the temple. All the gold in the temple melted, ran down between those huge blocks. And to get at that gold, they tore the temple apart block by block. Tore the thing to the ground. And the Jews went into exile for 2,000 years. They were in exile until 1948. So they got their way. They rejected the merciful kingship of Jesus, and chose the cruel kingship of Caesar. That's the way it goes with people who reject Christ. The people who reject Christ plunge themselves into diverse pains and miseries. Verse 16. Then delivered he therefore unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. And bearing his cross, went forth unto a place called the place of a skull, which in Hebrew is Golgotha. So Jesus has been scourged, and now onto that scourging, they place this heavy cross. As he's stumbling through the streets, it makes us think back to our Old Testament history. That there was another son who was loved, who was carrying the wood for his own sacrifice up the mountain. And that's Isaac. Carried his own wood for the sacrifice up the mountain. And that's a picture of Christ. That was Isaac. Abraham and Isaac were a forerunner, an image, a shadow of what was to come when Christ carried his cross up the hill to Golgotha. Now I've seen a picture of this hill. The hill is still there in Jerusalem today. I've never had the privilege of visiting Jerusalem. But if you look at the picture, it's a fairly large prominence. You use your imagination a little bit, and you can see, what looks like a skull. The way the mountains, the way the rocks are. You see this pair of eyes and space where the nose would belong, and you can see that. With a little bit of imagination, you can see why they would call it the skull. Now, Golgotha is the Hebrew word. The Latin word is Calvary. In Latin, that was Mount Calvary. There they crucified him, and two others with him, one on either side, Jesus in the midst, fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah that in his death he would be numbered with the transgressors. They did this to shame him. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title then read, many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh unto the city. And it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. So it was customary when someone was crucified that they would have a placard put around their neck describing their offense, so that people could see this and read this and be warned, don't do that. Whatever the offense was, don't do that. And so instead of stating the charge, so there was no offense on this title that Pilate had made for Jesus. It simply stated, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And it probably wasn't the ordinary practice to put it in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Hebrew In the Hebrew language are written the oracles of God. Greek, the philosophy of men. In Latin, the laws of the land. So people would be able to read this, and it was close enough to the city that the people would go to read it. They would go to see this spectacle and read this title, this placard. And probably Pilate wrote this. It was calculated to irritate the Jews. Because the chief priests said to Pilate, "Write not the King of the Jews," but that he said, "I am the King of the Jews." So Pilate finds a bit of courage and answers, "What I have written, I have written." Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, so I'm just looking at our clock and looking at the number of verses we have left. I think I'm going to stop there. Instead of going into the soldiers dividing the garments, we'll stop at the title for today, and we'll pick up here again, Lord willing, next week.